Greetings, sisters and brothers. Good to be back with you again for our Midweek Meditation from Christ the King Lutheran Church. Today I want to take a slightly different tack and reflect a little bit more on the gospel text that we had heard from this past Sunday and informed a part of my sermon, that very interesting story of Jesus meeting with a Canaanite woman. There are many complications to that, and there are also significant meanings from that for our own day, to be sure. So I look forward to reflecting on that with you around the whole rubric, too, of irony. That is how things can be even funny and full of convicting at the same time. But now, let's enjoy a meditative piece from our music associate Mary Joy Silmaro, a Sarabande in D minor, by Johann Sebastian Bach. Welcome back. As I said, I'm glad to be with you again this week for our Midweek Med. And it begins with, I'll call it kind of a humorous and ironic situation that I came upon just 2 weeks ago. On my Apple Watch, like perhaps many of you, I've been receiving many push phone calls, phishing phone calls, sometimes up to twice a day, from some place in the Garden State of New Jersey, a place called Bayonne, New Jersey. I have no idea where it is. I don't know anything about the place, except that whenever it flashes up on my phone and on my watch, I immediately press the stop call function and get rid of it. So whoever's trying to get a hold of me from Bayonne, New Jersey is persistent. No question, because that still happens. Why is that of interest? Well, it's kind of comedic, because as I shared last week, one of the things I rediscovered, and this dates me, no question, there in my different kind of isolation with Joan and Fittich in our home up above the Mississippi in the Midwest, I was looking around for evening entertainment, came across YouTube, having a whole compendium of Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons. Well, there you go. You can come to understand some of my warped sense of humor by understanding that I was raised on Rocky and Bullwinkle with their very mature, sardonic, satirical kind of humor. And there, of course, in part of the ongoing storylines with Rocky and Bullwinkle would be Boris and Natasha. And always they were trying to invoke some sort of conspiracy to get rid of Rocky and Bullwinkle, because they were, of course, Rocky and Bullwinkle, agents of the Free West. And those being the Cold War days, I already understood what kind of humor, and political humor even, was being invoked by the Rocky and Bullwinkle series. Well, here it is. Bayonne, New Jersey shows up on my, as I said, watch frequently. And in the very first instance of watching Rocky and Bullwinkle back from the 60s, some phone call comes through from Natasha to Boris. She says, "Boris, a phone call for you from Bayonne, New Jersey." I don't know, maybe there's something funny about Bayonne. I'm going to have to look it up. But there it was, long, long ago, in the very sardonic humor of the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. I'm going to call that a bit more than coincidence. I'm going to call that irony. And I want to reflect on how necessary even a good sense of humor, even irony, is to Christian faith. There's probably, I would assert, a strong connection between humorlessness and the rise of fundamentalisms and the rise of literalism, particularly since the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, around 1905, with the publication of the fundamentals that formally began the fundamentalist movement within Christianity, and that whole turn to literalism, which had not been there in such a way before in almost 2,000 years of faith. That whole turn to literalism went into a very serious and eventually politicized mode. Rocky and Bullwinkle were very clear with their irony, with the Cold War in the background, about how stupid conspiracy theories could be, how silly, and how we could make fun of them. Well, we've got conspiracy theories today that go hand in glove with a lack of humor. Call it, this phenomenon that's curious to me, QAnon, for example. All this bizarre, scurrilous stuff from somebody wearing, must be, a tinfoil hat or a spaghetti strainer. And the sense of humor there is not at all developed. The sense of literacy there is not at all possible for faith. Lots of weird and regrettable and even vile projections about the worst state of human being with one another. The worst kinds of charges against other people. Why is irony on my mind? Because that kind of assertion we would find plastered throughout various propaganda modes today, especially in realms of faith, especially in the horizon of a very conservative kind of Christianity. It would do well, it seems to me, to benefit from a healthy dose of irony, a healthy dose of humor. How do I come to that? Well, it's by way of a hard text that when not read ironically, can be a very difficult one for people to understand, and in fact they may well decide that this is not the Jesus that we want on the premise of such interpretation. I'm looking at Matthew 15 again, verses 21 through 28, when Jesus goes into the district of Tyre and Sidon. This is outside Israel, into quite a different culture, and there he meets a Canaanite woman. This woman is not necessarily one that we would welcome easily at the Galleria or out on the street, walking around the rice track, wherever, because she's acting out too. It's an uncomfortable framing for the whole story. It goes like this. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Now, maybe we can identify. We've been in those situations where a person might come to us, say, at a busy intersection, come to the car, or in a crowd and start shouting and say, "Give me $5, or I'll wash your windshield if you help me for some food," etc. Often we will respond positively, sometimes not. Sometimes we may well lock the door and want to be sure that we are not accosted in some uncomfortable way. There's a way in which we can sink into the discomfort of this situation as it began to unfold. Contemporary interpretations differ, but are often fairly united around the idea, especially from a feminist theological point of view, that Jesus did not respond in a friendly manner to her. Some interpretations will say that indeed Jesus responding to her by way, at least indirectly, of calling her a dog was not only not friendly, it was misogynist, hateful, patriarchal, maybe even racist. Some interpreters, even a generation or 2 generations ago, said, well, maybe that's not quite all of it. We have to understand that Jesus is a man, a human being like us, a creature of his times. And so, of course, you might have a certain attitude with respect to his being a son of David, as she called out, there in the Jewish culture. A Jewish culture that had been well set against Canaanites in a kind of identity politics, a kind of racism. And so acknowledging that maybe Jesus had a certain unrecognized bias, those interpretations, often informed by early liberation theology, said, well, look, Moses had God change God's mind. Surely it's possible that Jesus could change his mind, and in this most grace-giving way, by way of someone wholly other than those to whom he was originally called, to whom he was sent. That's a viable interpretation and may well fit how we finally land. I cast that in the context more broadly of Jesus having many positive occasions, encounters with women, Jewish and non-Jewish, sinful and not necessarily recognized as sinful. So it's a little more difficult for me to come to a conclusion straight away that Jesus was misogynist. In fact, where I am tending to lead in my interpretation is that Jesus consciously going into a different country and then using this particular analogy about pets and dogs in that country says something about Jesus himself using his knowledge of cross-cultural experience, employing his own cross-cultural interpretation and wisdom, so to come to a larger point about the mission of God to the world. Jesus says, shall we take the food and pass it to the dogs, or feed the dogs with what I have? Saying that in the Jewish manner, he was meant to be just for the house of Israel. But ironically, in so saying, and irony is the issue here, maybe he said it with a bit of tongue-in-cheek. We don't have the stage directions. We don't have those notes on the side like you would see in a Shakespearean play of entry and exeunt. We don't have, a direction from somebody out on the other side of the Klieg light saying, okay, now put your hand on your head, or some such. What we have is a kind of a Rocky and Bullwinkle, perhaps, one-liner that is saturated with irony and knowledge of the state of affairs, even in a different culture. That different culture being one which was much more pet-friendly, at least with dogs, than was the Jewish culture at the time. That particular culture in Cana, being where dogs frequently were around the table, regrettably perhaps like Fittich is frequently on my lap as soon as the food comes out of the refrigerator. So it is we become accustomed to different ways of being with all God's creatures, great and small. And then in her saying, picking up on, as it were, the pun, she recognizes that she does indeed have access there and may be bold in faith in a way that even Jesus' own people at the time were not. Not so bold as to call him Son of David. Quite a messianic title. Not so bold as to ask for themselves what would be healing. And in this case for her, this Canaanite woman, otherwise unnamed, she pleads not so much for herself, but out of the purity and abundance of love for her daughter, who is sick at home. And so immediately the power of mercy and grace flows from Jesus in this wonderful coming together of faith and resource availability. It all comes together there with perhaps a tongue-in-cheek that invited her to be so bold. So Christians, because of Easter, have been said to have a sense of humor. We are surrounded on every side by lots of challenge. Don't need to go into the details now. We are surrounded by every side of Borises and Natashas that are not quite so stupidly trying to invoke their conspiracies. We are surrounded on every side by the hate mongers and the conspiracy theorists and so forth, who, I plead to God, would be given a sense of humor, which means a sense of self. And with that, we ourselves be given all more deeply a sense of self. And where does the sense of self go? Straight to the person of Jesus, wherever he is, available to everybody, with what to the world looks like ironic grace. What? She gets some? Yes. What? I get grace? Perhaps even more ironically, yes. And quite unironically, but straightforwardly, God has it all for you too. Grace is there more than virtually. It's in your hands and in your heart now. May the world see us act with humor and self-understanding and all due passion and joy, with such faith as comes from such ironic grace. Christ's peace be with you in this week, the rest of all our days, particularly through the difficult ones to come. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.